Greetings everyone, and today I'll be taking Nikon's kit lens for APS-C Digital SLR cameras out for a test drive. We have the AF-P DX Nikon 18 to 55mm f3.5 to 5.6 GVR. It's distinguishable from older Nikon kit lenses by its shape and with its AF-P designation, which stands for pulse motor or stepping motor. It also doesn't have a designated switch to turn its vibration reduction system on and off, so you have to do that in your camera's menus. If you own an older Nikon digital SLR camera, then there's quite a good chance that it's not actually compatible with it. Take a look in the description for a link to Nikon's official compatibility chart, which you see here. The cameras that it does work with properly may also need a firmware update, but if the lens came with your camera, then obviously it is compatible, or you can buy it separately for about $200 or even cheaper over on eBay. An 18 to 55mm kit lens on an APS-C camera gives you a relatively useful basic zoom range from wide angle to short telephoto. What it won't give you is a bright maximum aperture for shooting in darker conditions or getting out of focus backgrounds. In fact, the maximum aperture darkens to just f5.6 as you zoom in, which means the lens really isn't letting in very much light. If that doesn't bother you though, it can actually be a really useful instrument, and just about all of them nowadays offer image stabilization, or VR as Nikon call it. Image stabilization will hold your image more steady for you to help you get sharper pictures. Here's some footage with it turned off and now turned on. As you can see, it certainly makes quite a big difference. This particular kit lens is specially designed to be extra small, being collapsible. There's a special button that you have to push to open it up for use. The lens is not weather sealed and it's based on a cheap plastic lens mount, so don't go throwing it at anything or using it to hammer nails. The main control point is its zoom ring, which turns very unevenly and a bit stiffly. It's not much fun to use. Conversely, the manual focus ring above that feels lovely and smooth to turn. It works with the lens's autofocus motor and is actually quite responsive in use. As the lens changes focus, you don't get much focus breathing either. As you can see here, the lens does not zoom in and out, which is helpful for video makers. The autofocus motor works silently and reasonably quickly without any real problems. The lens weighs only 200 grams and its front filter size is 55mm in diameter. Overall, it's very cheap and very small, simple and plasticky. But in use, it works perfectly nicely without any problems. So, let's take a look at image quality. We'll start at the widest angle of 18mm and to the brightest aperture of f3.5. Image quality in the middle of the picture is reasonably sharp, contrast is just okay. Corner image quality sees some sharpness, but also a load of colour fringing and some ghosting in the very edges. Stop down the aperture to f5.6 for a little more brightness and clarity there, but back in the middle, the lens has become pin sharp and contrast is greatly improved. Stop down to f8 and it's perhaps even a touch sharper there, but the image corners see only a tiny improvement in contrast, and stop down to f11 for another tiny improvement there. If you stop the aperture down to f16 or darker, then your image will begin to get softer from the unavoidable physical effects of diffraction. So you can get some very good sharpness at wide angles from f5.6, although the corners are a touch messy. Let's zoom the lens in about halfway now to 35mm, where the maximum aperture has now darkened to f4.5. The middle of the image continues to look pleasingly sharp here, and the corners a little bit soft. If you stop down to f5.6, there's only a minuscule improvement, but stop down to f8 for a dramatic increase in sharpness, and f11 looks quite brilliant. Finally, let's zoom all the way into 55mm. The new maximum aperture is f5.6, and the lens remains nice and sharp in the middle of your images. The corners also look pretty good, which is impressive, and stop down to f8 for even a tiny bit more sharpness there. If you are somebody who really happens to love the effects of diffraction making soft images, then this lens enables you to stop all the way down to f32 when you're zoomed in for some pretty impressively unusable images. but overall we can be pretty happy with its performance. The key issue for it is corner image quality at wider angles, although stopping down the lens's aperture to f8 or f11 bring them into line quite nicely. Alright, let's take a look at distortion and vignetting. These are the results if you turn image corrections off or shoot in RAW mode. At the widest angle of 18mm, we're treated to some pretty strong barrel distortion here, and at f3.5 the corners are rather dark too. Stop down to f5.6 for a lot more brightness in those corners, although the vignetting never completely goes away. Zoom in to 35mm and that distortion straightens out. If you zoom into 55mm, then you'd normally expect to see quite some pincushion distortion on a standard zoom lens, but this one manages to avoid that quite well, and at f5.6 the corners are only a little bit dark, so it's a better than average performance for vignetting and distortion here, particularly once you've zoomed in a bit. Let's take a look at close-up image quality now. The lens can focus as closely as 25cm to your subject. Fantastic, really. You can get really close to your subjects here. The not so good news is that close-up image quality is very soft and ghostly at f5.6. Stop down to f8 and both sharpness and contrast are improved, but at f11 there's no further improvement, so that's the close-up image quality you're stuck with, I'm afraid. Next, let's see how the lens works against bright lights, and the answer is fantastically well, actually, with some of the least flaring I've seen in a long time. The small size of this lens's glass elements are surely helping out here. And finally, bokeh. This lens is probably the last you should be thinking of for getting out of focus backgrounds, what with its dark maximum aperture and fairly wide angle zoom range. If you zoom right into your subject, and if it's small enough, then those backgrounds you get look reasonably soft, but nothing to write home about. Overall, the Nikon AF-P DX 18-55mm VR is a pretty good kit lens. Its creative possibilities might be rather limited by its narrow maximum aperture, but it is at least pretty sharp, with good contrast. The autofocus and image stabilization work fine, it's nice and small, and its zoom range will cover your basic needs. It's a great little starter lens for your Nikon APS-C camera, or you can find it on eBay for well under £100, so for that, it comes recommended.